Okay, welcome everyone to the spring semester kickoff for our Rethinking work series. We are going to let everyone in the webinar room give people a few minutes to gather. And I'm going to remind everyone of how we are going to run through the show today. So just seeing people coming in, everyone welcome on this sunny and chilly day in New York City, but you might be calling in from anywhere in the country and even in the world. So, and it's definitely worth your time today. All right, so I am Anna Tavis. The department chair and professor at Human Capital Management Department, School of Professional Studies, and I'm hosting this event. Delighted to have our guest, Annie Dean, Global Head of Team Anywhere at Atlassian. And I have to tell you, this is going to be really worth your time, not only because of the topic that remains to be top of mind, but also because of the personal story that Annie brings to this and her career that brings to this topic and the research and her role and mission at Atlassian. Just as a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A box. The way we're going to run the webinar is going to be that Annie is going to do an introduction. It's going to be a live conversation, no presentation, but just a conversation that will take place. And then in halfway through it, we are going to be addressing your questions. So please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A box. And then I also want to, just out of curiosity in the chat, please tell us where you're calling from, so we have a good sense of what's who is on in the room and what kind of geography we're addressing here. All right, so just a couple of introductory words, because I know the speakers usually are a little shy about talking about themselves. What I want to say is Annie has been a guest speaker in our MIU programs, classes, and she was definitely rated at the top of the charts. My students were absolutely excited, learned a lot, and felt a real personal connection to Annie. So she's the global head of Team Anywhere at Atlassian, and I love this title, Team Anywhere, head of Team Anywhere. If you see that job posted, it's probably a big job. She's responsible for 11,000 plus person companies shift to a distributed work model. Annie oversees not just the distributed work model, but also real estate and workplace experience teams, along with the kind of research-focused Team Anywhere lab. It's a dedicated group of behavioral scientists focused on designing and validating evidence-based ways of working. And I want to highlight this, evidence-based ways of working. Prior to joining Atlassian, Annie was Meta's first director of remote work, where she created and led a portfolio of future of work strategies. And she's a global recognized expert on remote and flexible work. She has been featured by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Fast Company. And on this note, Annie, please take it away, share with us what you've done, a little bit of the story, and we will have a conversation about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And it's great to be with you all today from so many different places and across many different industries. I am such a fan of Dr. Tavis and all of her work. Loved meeting your class, Anna, and I saw Stella in the chat. It's a great group of really smart people, and I love being part of it. So Atlassian is a company that builds collaboration software, which means that we help people work across a distance. And in 2020, our founders recognized that there was an opportunity to embrace a different way of working, not just because they thought it was the right thing to do and a more human way to work, but also it would help us innovate for our customers. And I've been incredibly fortunate to do this work where I lead how and where we work, and how that transformation is unfolding, because it's relevant to our business. And that gives me a different opportunity to invest and get executive level support to research and design the right way to get this stuff done, so that we can solve these problems ahead of our customers. As Anna mentioned, I run real estate, a team of researchers who study how work happens. And I also oversee our talent programs and policies, including things like onboarding. And that gives me a wide canvas of transformation where I can study and design exactly how those things need to change in the modern work environment that we find ourselves. And that relates to how we collaborate with one another, and also literally how our offices look and are designed so that we can create new kinds of value in our built spaces. So with all of that said, I would say that, first of all, I've been doing this work for 10 years now, which is sort of amazing to say. And I came to the work honestly. I was a corporate attorney on Wall Street, and I was a third-year associate, fresh out of law school when I had my first son. And I was at a point in my career where I was, tapped to do all of the best deals, and had a great career potential. But I didn't have a lot of autonomy in my deal structure, so I was the one who was at my desk until 4 o'clock in the morning, turning all of the documents. And that was a really difficult proposition for a young woman who was also figuring out how to manage a child. I was never seeing my son during waking hours. I was struggling to figure out how to manage breastfeeding and being up all night. And I literally was getting no sleep. And I started to have a really difficult personal experience where I felt like I just couldn't keep going. And that led me to really think, well, I'm really tough. And if I can't handle this, what does this mean for everybody else who's in my situation? And at that moment, I became really interested in the macro impact of what it means to get work done differently, efficiently, and more effectively. And so I ended up founding a startup, which was a people analytics startup to help the Fortune 500 understand the opportunity for flexible work. And that was really interesting. We did research at the time to understand the unmet need for flexibility across areas like caregiving, well-being, and commuting. And they were, as you would expect, there was a deeply unmet need in the workforce. And there was an opportunity, if we met that need, to especially accelerate women's career potential. And, so when my company was acquired in January 2020, and I thought, you know what, this future of work thing, I can see it, it's going to happen. Place matters less as we continue to put things on the internet and make things digital, which was a revolution that was happening across many different industries at the time. And, I ended up going to Deloitte thinking I've been a lawyer, I've been a founder, and now I'll go get an education across different industries and business. And the pandemic unfolded. I thought I would spend 10% of my time on the future of work, and the pandemic unfolded just 3 weeks later. I started at Deloitte on February 22nd, 2020, or February 24th, 2020. And the rest is kind of history. And so I was advising the Fortune 500 C-suite to figure out how to institute work from home orders. Some of the interesting things that were happening at the time is that executive leadership was asking questions like, how can we get people up elevators safely at 6-foot distance? And the answer was we couldn't. It would have taken 7 or 8 hours to get an office building of people up the elevator. And so then we had to start taking new ways of working more seriously. And I helped advise on those immediate reactions as well as the longer term policies that unfolded from them. What was interesting is that CIOs at the time did not even have calendar invites as a default, did not even have Zoom links as a default in their calendar invites. So the world has really changed, even though I know that it feels like we're kind of moving backwards right now in this, progression towards working from many more places. But we have made a ton of progress. Flexibility is much more the norm than it was today than it was in 2018 when I was doing research that said that if people wanted to go to the doctor, they felt like they needed to take a sick day. So we have covered a lot of ground. I then, ended up going to Facebook, then Facebook, now Meta, to help them set the first kind of market leading set of policies on remote work. At the time, they had an ambition to be 50% remote within the next 10 years. And then fortunately, I got invited to come to Atlassian, where I've been able to lead the scope that I described at the beginning of this call. And it's been such a fun time. I would say what I've learned is that every company needs to undertake. Well, let me pause. What's the opportunity? So I think that, there's a lot of conversation around distributed work, remote work, etc. I like to use the word distributed because remote work is a word that describes where work happens, and it describes it in relationship to an office. But I think that what is unfolding is that there is an opportunity to change how we work. And as a result of that, where we work matters less. And I'll caveat that to say that where we work still matters. Having an office is, I think, an important part of any enterprise strategy. And it's a critical way for groups to come together, for companies to communicate their culture, and for companies to offer a place for people to be able to really get their work done. But in the age of AI, which is powered on digital interactions and virtual collaboration, we need to start changing how work happens so that we can keep pace with the technology opportunity that's unfolding in front of us. And that means that there are some real changes that need to happen at the enterprise to change that reality. So if you think about where we were in 2020, we've come off of basically 100-year cycle where all knowledge work happened in an office. And we started to conflate work with offices. And ultimately, we need to start driving daylight between those two things, where work is something that happens on the internet, mostly in virtual forums. And offices are places where people come to be together, to celebrate their company culture, to work because that's where it feels best to work. I was speaking yesterday to one of my favorite researchers in the space, Raj Chaudhry at Harvard Business School. And his latest research shows that people don't even just work from home and the office. They actually work on average at 3.5 different places, which we know intuitively, but sometimes we just need the data to be able to establish it for us. Even our business laws have been established based on offices. So one of the big challenges that a person in my role has to deal with is when people work in many different countries and many different locations, how do we manage that from a compliance perspective? And the reality is that there isn't a good regulatory system for businesses to predict whether or not their employees' presence in a country gives rise to liability. Because our existing laws are based on the concept of what we call permanent establishment. And permanent establishment means that there is a stable, regulatable business presence in a country. And usually it's defined by whether or not there's an office there. And obviously movement has, the way employees move through the world has totally changed. So it's not just our mindsets that need to change, it's our practices, it's our programs at our companies, it's our strategies, and it's even our regulations. So with all of that said, at Atlassian, I think we've discovered that there are 3 big shifts that every company needs to make. And if they want to capture the opportunity to work differently and also build a culture that celebrates flexibility and rolls out that flexibility in a way that supports business progress and performance. So on the one hand, we want to be able to design our teams, and we need a new way to design our teams and connect. The second big transformation is that we need a new way to work. And the third transformation is that we need a new way to design and operate our offices. So I'm going to go through, Anna, if this works, I'm going to go through each of those transformations, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we've learned at Atlassian, and then we can turn it over to the audience for questions. I know this is a bit of a whirlwind tour through the concepts of distributed work. Okay, so when we say we need a new way to design teams and connect, let's talk about the challenges that we have. So in an office-based culture, in a pre-pandemic office-based culture, usually people came into the office on a regular basis and teams were co-located, or they were largely co-located. More often than not, they were co-located, meaning that everybody who worked on a working team usually was concentrated around one office location. So if you ask people to come into the office, it was the reality that working teams would run into one another. Now, co-location has drastically changed. Teams are wildly more distributed. Microsoft research shows that in 2019, 64% of their teams were co-located. Now that number is 25%. And as we continue to compete for the best talent in the world, especially in areas like machine learning and AI engineering, we know that we want to be in a position to get talent from wherever that talent is located. The market is on their side, right? And so that means that we are naturally going to have co-located teams. That's sort of the non-co-located teams, distributed teams. That's sort of the strategic position for businesses to take. And so when we think about that idea of teams being distributed, we have to avoid the idea that teams can literally work anywhere. So one of my title is a bit of a misnomer, Team Anywhere, because yes, people can work in many more places, but not literally anywhere. Because in order to collaborate effectively, they need to have overlap in their working day. And they also need to have programs and corporate motions that keep those teams deeply connected. So here's how we've solved that at Atlassian. One is that we have what we call stripes. So imagine the world as a flat map with 6 vertical stripes of equal width drawn across the map. And that is giving you 6 time zone stripes across the map. Within each stripe, everyone in that stripe has 4 hours of working hours overlap in their day. If you take 2 stripes side by side, in one stripe, you have 8 hours of working hours overlap in their day. If you take 2 stripes, then everyone has 4 hours of working hours overlap. And this is the design principle that leads to successfully designed teams. You want to make sure that teams can actually access and work together. We've found that if you are in your earliest stage of your career, so if you're a couple of years out of university or the equivalent, then you need to be in a position with your manager where you have a full working day of overlap, 8 hours of overlap. That doesn't mean you need to be in the same office. It doesn't mean you need to be in the same city. It means that you need to be in the same 1/6 of the globe. So that you can access your manager at any time that you're working. It reduces all of the friction to be able to answer questions. I will say, by the way, that those early career employees are actually the most likely to live near the office and to attend the office because they love being part of an in-person community. If you are kind of your standard team, so you've moved on from being the higher risk cohort of your early career, you need about 4 hours of working hours overlap to do your job effectively. So this is an example, for instance, where I'm on the East Coast in New York City, and a lot of my collaborators are on the West Coast of the US in California. I have a quiet morning and we have a deep overlap towards the end of my day. Their day is reversed. They have a lot of collaboration in their early morning, and then they switch into focus mode towards the afternoon. If you are among the most senior folks in your company and you're managing one of the most senior folks in your company, you can probably get away with just 2 hours of working hours overlap in your day. But I really would recommend that only when the business is sophisticated or mature enough to be run on a metrics basis, basically where you're kind of out of innovation maker mode. And you really are more running processes that are well documented and have measurable outcomes. Um, otherwise you want to make sure that you are within the 4 hours overlap. So again, that's 1 stripe or 8 hours for your earliest career, 2 stripes or 4 hours for most of your teams. And if you're among the most senior folks managing someone quite senior, you can spread across what we call 3 stripes, which would create only 2 hours of overlap. And then we also created something called intentional togetherness. So this is the idea that teams come together in their working group uh, a few times a year. And they do that for, anywhere between 2 and 5 days. I would say we're increasingly focusing on keeping things a bit shorter. 2 days has turned out, as we continue to study things, to be a little bit more effective than the longer period of time, which tends to make people really tired. And we fund people to come together in one of our offices, whatever is the most economical related to where everybody happens to be located. And they really throw away the calendar and focus on their most complex tasks. They're creative together. If they're a new team, they work on establishing and forming the norms of that team. And one of the things that we do is we passively measure team connection all the time at Atlassian. It's something that we measure through our, routine surveys. And we found that people who attend these gatherings experience a boost in connection of about 27%. That's significant. Nothing else that we do, it drives connection at that level. And that feeling of connection doesn't decay for 4 to 5 months, which means that getting together 2 to 3 times per year is probably all teams really need to feel deeply connected. And we know that a deeply connected team is more likely to be a highly effective team. So that's why it really matters. We're not just talking about feelings of connection or feelings of belonging. We also studied the feelings of connection for people who attend the office. So at Atlassian, office attendance is optional for everyone. It is not mandated for anyone to attend, other than if you happen to have a role that is office based, like one of our workplace experience folks who manage the office. And we found that sporadically attending the office did not change feelings of connection. It was not at all a driver of connection. Now, it does help feelings of belonging and participating in the wider culture of the company. But in terms of the connection that drives team performance on a working team, coming together in these intentional multi-day settings was far more effective. So that's kind of our two big, investments that we've made on designing teams and connecting. I will say, by the way, that designing teams by time zone, we sort of say it's by time zone, not zip code. It's a work in progress. We definitely do not have the perfect design to be able to accommodate or predict where every single person is located. It's not entirely consistent across the organization. We are based in Australia, and so time zones are something that we consistently work with and continue our maturity in. And the last thing I'll say about connection is that we have been able to be smart about our real estate, and that's enabled us to reduce our footprint to some extent and reinvest some of those savings in connection, things like our connection program. So many companies have a feeling like, it's not worth it to spend on the T&E to bring people together. But because we see such high ROI, and because we've been able to realize savings in other places, we find that it is a worthy expenditure. Also, by holding these gatherings in our office setting, we subsidize the cost of the program by about 90%, which means it's very cost effective overall. Okay, so you have teams that are designed well. They're not just working anywhere. They actually are designed to make sure that they have the right circumstances for collaboration. And despite the fact that they're not coming together in an office every day, which, by the way, everyone is not because teams are not co-located, they have a thoughtful and continued way to connect. So your teams are well designed for collaboration and connection. Check, check. Now you need to think about a new way to work. So especially, and I really think that this is the story of AI. It's been the story of technology all along, but now it is the story of AI. And what we're learning about how we need to work differently is that even before AI was disrupting how we work at Atlassian, we recognized something interesting. We studied the effectiveness of all of our teams, and we found out that the most effective teams at the company had something in common. And it was that they were distributed across locations within the design that I laid out before, meaning that they had about 4 hours of working hours overlap, and none of the team members were isolated, meaning that everyone was in that 4 hours and they didn't have one person who happened to be unreachable during the workday. And so we started to get really curious. That was great for us. That was not what we were expecting. And we started to dig into that, and we found that teams that were distributed had developed better systems of communicating with one another and of documenting their progress to keep people informed no matter what time of day it was. So basically, these teams figured out how to use information other than meetings to keep people progressing and moving towards their goals. And so we started to study that and run experiments and replicate that and figure out, well, what are the best things that people need to be doing in order to overcome the challenges of work today? And some of the other challenges of work today is that 65% of knowledge workers in a Fortune 500 study we did said that it was more important to respond to notifications than it was to progress work. 98% of Fortune 500 executives that we surveyed said that their teams could collaborate in half the time. They could make the same progress in half the time if they collaborated differently. Something like 50% of teams said that they were doing duplicative work with other teams and didn't find out until later. These are the problems of work, and none of them are solved by being in an office. They are solved by working differently. So when we think about what the best teams are doing to work differently, we've broken it into a couple of different buckets. The first is that great teams know what's important. They have goals, and those goals are clearly communicated across their immediate team and the wider teams across the company. As somebody who leads a transformation team, it's so important for me to know what brand's goals are, product marketing goals are, where engineering is in their product push, and what product we're building for our next big release. Um, I'm able to stay informed and to direct my own team and their cross-functional priorities based on the goals that I'm aware of across the wider company. Goals are also a really important way to tell the story of what matters. So at Atlassian, we have just 3 goals across the entire company, and anyone at Atlassian could recite them to you because they're so deeply part of how we report out on our progress, how our executives communicate success and challenges and progress, etc. So once you have those goals, then the next thing that people need to figure out how to do is spend their time differently. And that largely has to do with communicating in more effective ways. So my very favorite thing to give teams is this framework called Smart Brevity. It was created by Jim Vandehey, who is the founder of Axios. And I swear that I am Smart Brevity's #1 fan. It should be official sales channel partner. And it basically helps you write scannable Slack messages that anyone can digest in the 22 seconds of attention that they give your written message. So even if you're sending a 6-paragraph email, it's not going to be fully consumed in the 22 seconds on average that a reader pays attention. And so I have found that by using a very clear communication framework, it helps my team surface to me what's truly important. And that makes it easier for me to inform both across the business and up the chain. And then it makes it possible to replace meetings. We have a tool called Loom that we use. It's a video messaging platform that's very intuitive in both emojis and conversational. It's titled by AI. AI summaries are created, and it's a great way to share your thoughts in an unstructured way without having to bring people into a meeting. When we start to figure out how to communicate differently, we can save so much time. And that means that we have more time to invest in our focus work. And I mean that both in the focus work that we do individually and the focus work that we do in teams. One of the things that people notice about working with me is that we do spend a lot of time in meeting sessions, but they are working sessions. We solve problems together. We leave that forum after having set a goal and accomplished it. We spend time being creative, and we make sure that by the end of our workday, we have completed our most important task. The last thing is about information. So, the thing that I think everyone needs to understand about AI is that it is powered on digital interactions. AI doesn't know what's happening at the water cooler. It's powered by your messages, by your video transcripts. It's powered by the designs that you put together in your design platform, in all of the strategy documentation that you have in your documentation tool. And when you allow AI to access that, you can find all the information that you need at your company instantly by just asking your AI interface, as opposed to needing to schedule a meeting for that. And that saves so much time and makes teams move so much faster. Because the way that we're doing it today is by playing telephone instead of using technology, which means that it could take me 3 to 4 days to get someone on the line to explain to me the information I need to know, that I can now unblock myself with in 10 seconds using AI, or our tool internally is called Rovo. So when we start to work that way, you realize that it's really about digital interaction and optimizing how we work together, as opposed to spending time together to make the work happen. And I hesitate in saying that, because what it actually does is it frees us up to spend more time together, but it gives us the opportunity to spend that time together on what's important, instead of status updates, sharing information, and other things that slow us down in the enterprise. All right, last big change is, if we've changed how we work, if we change how teams are designed, if we have now events where people come together as opposed to daily mandatory office attendance, what needs to happen to our offices? And so every company needs to create a new way to design and operate offices. So I'll tell you a little bit about the task that we had when the pandemic was unfolding. When I took on the real estate organization, offices were still closed. And we needed to figure out what we would do when offices were allowed to safely reopen. And that gave us an opportunity to consider, well, what ROI do offices really have for us? We knew the ROI would be high, because we knew the office would be a really critical way to bring people together. People were really, excited to get together. A lot of people prefer to work in the office. And by the way, despite the fact that our office attendance is voluntary, most people, more than half of people who live near an office, come in 2 times a week. So our offices are very well attended, and it is something that people love to participate in. So when we were doing an analysis to figure out what the ROI is, we looked at our pre-pandemic offices and our post-pandemic offices, and we compared them by looking at what it literally cost every single time somebody visited the office. We call this cost per visit. And basically, we took all of the costs of operating the office, CapEx, OpEx, the food and beverage programs, everything. And we divided it by the literal number of visits, which we measure by VPN access, anonymized. And we found, of course, that our post-pandemic office visits were costing us a lot more, because we had many fewer visits. And so we started to move in the direction of understanding, if there was an office where the cost per visit was much more expensive, we started to dive quite a bit deeper. And we wanted to treat our offices like a product. So we started to treat our visitors like users, and we wanted to learn a lot more about our users. Who in our office population was within 20 to 30 minutes of the office? Who was within 2 hours of the office? And how engaged were those communities of people? How frequently were people coming from outside of a commutable distance, meaning that they were visiting the office perhaps for a gathering? For instance, in New York, we found that 50% of our office visits were people that were coming in from out of town. And that led us to make different design choices in our offices to accommodate larger scale visits. In our user or visitor population data, we started to realize that many of our local communities were very, very engaged. So if you were somebody who was 20 to 30 minutes from the office, we were finding something like 78% of them were coming in multiple times a week. And so we really needed to consider the health and the value of our offices based on the community that surrounded them and start to engage our users in a different way. As we started to build this understanding of our metrics and did continuous reviews on our users to try to serve our visitors differently, some big trends began to emerge. And that's where that has defined our approach to offices today. The big trends are that people are coming to the office less frequently, and so they know less about how to engage with the services and etiquette there. That means that more like a hotel, we need a staff and team that can easily integrate a new visitor into the space, set clear expectations, and make it seamless and easy for that visitor to be successful there. So that has led us to have a much more hospitality focused approach to operating our offices. The next thing is that there were many more intentional gatherings at offices. So instead of coming to the office Monday through Thursday or whatever the norm was pre-pandemic, I might grab 3 friends and say, let's go to the office together next Wednesday. And then ultimately, we might end up having a group of 12. That group of 12 might want to plan a lunch together. We realized that the office was becoming much more event-based. And that changed the technology that we needed, the AV services that we provided, the catering services that we provided. And it's required us, like a hospitality outfit, to figure out a discrete menu of services to be able to offer our visitors so that we can meet their expectations and take advantage of this event mentality to make it great for people. The reception to that has been incredibly well received. The last big change we made is what I kind of set up for us at the beginning, which is that our offices are a product. And we have a very different understanding of how work happens. We study through observational studies, through org network analyses, through looking at our products, by doing research in the field to understand what's different about how work happens today and what kind of spaces do we need to facilitate that. So a common theme I'm sure you'd hear if you speak to other leaders of real estate is that the conference rooms that serve 4 to 6 people are really not very well utilized. Well, the individual call spaces are extremely under available. There's not enough supply of them. And so we found that we need to move from sort of this mode of working that we thought was prevalent prior to the pandemic to a new etiquette-based understanding of what different behaviors people are using in the office on a day-to-day basis. Basically, they spend their morning in a quiet zone. They spend 2 to 3 hours in a private call space because all of their calls are individual phone calls. They sometimes visit a more dense cafe or hotel lobby-like space where they can take casual Zoom calls in a drop-in setting, and they can use just their laptop as opposed to needing a monitor and an ergonomic chair. This has totally transformed what our taxonomy of spaces is, as well as the types of equipment that we manage across our portfolio. And it's a slow process to get there because we invest, a little bit in one office at a time. We run a ton of live experiments just with soft furniture to understand how people adapt to spaces. And then we ultimately graduate that into a formalized space program. So by thinking about the office, not just as a service that's provided to the business, but as a product where we're continually reviewing our roadmap, our metrics, and our data to understand whether we're serving our users to deliver our business value is the new way to operate offices and real estate. So that is the 3 big swings that I'm seeing at Atlassian and some of the highlights on the data, but I would love to hear from all of you what questions you're working through.
Yes, and that's where I'm going to jump in. We have some really, really good questions here. And we'll start with the question, kind of with a personal question. To what extent do you think your background in law and the rigor of being an attorney influenced the way you approach the topic rather than, traditional HR approach that is about employee experience, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a great question. And I think that my legal background has served me well in 2 ways. One, an obsession with logical thinking. Um, and two, the ability to have a high degree of skepticism. So, as a lawyer, you are always trying to collect all of the facts and information, and you're highly skeptical about what everyone's telling you. So, you kind of feel like you have to validate yourself. But I would actually say that it's more the exposure that I had to architecture and design, growing up as the child of an architect, and always having a real passion for design in all of its forms, that has led me to want to make things, not just do things. And so when I think, if you're thinking about making a new way of working, um, I see a lot of folks who are trying to make these decisions, and they're looking at the present information, and they're stuck because they need a set of criteria with which to design, and they don't have those data sources, they don't have those kind of future focused principles. And so I think by taking a design mentality and really being principles first, and knowing that a design needs to be delivered based on information about what it should look like, I think is what has led me to really want to use data and research to build something new.
Yeah, I totally agree. I hear more and more that design skill set, understanding design is the future even of any profession, including HR. So thank you so much. Edie's question, Edie Goldberg here, about the goals. How do you share goals and
Mm.
progress within teams?
So I think this is really about technology. It's funny because I come to my obsession with Atlassian's tool set, honestly, because I really look at it problem first. And then I step back and I'm like, oh my gosh, Atlassian's tools really do all of this. So I don't mean this to be a love letter to Atlassian, but I truly believe it. We have something called the goals platform. Internally, we call it Atlas, and you might hear it referred to that way by Atlassian nerds. But what it does is you can publish your goals, and then you publish projects that are associated with each of those goals. And each Friday, the team publishes a 140 character update that gets published to that goal. So when I log into my computer on Monday mornings, I'm able to see all of my goals, which are consistent, right? They're in a KR format. So they are, on a minimum quarterly basis, but they could be on an annual or even 3-year basis. Um, and I see the updates to all of the projects that are happening. And my org is about 100 people, and if I was doing this in a synchronous format, my leads would really be only able to tell me that high level information or surface risks to me. But by getting visibility on every project, which is incredibly easy to consume, I'm able to issue spot where things might be going off the tracks with greater awareness. And I'm also able to know more about the capability of all of my team players, which is interesting. So it gives me an opportunity to really be able to provide feedback to their leaders, or to congratulate them and tell them what a great job that they're doing. It just gives me a deeper visibility. And that's how it works functionally. But then also, when there are important pieces of information or projects that are happening cross functionally, similarly, I can be a follower on that project. And I might not be engaging at the same rate. I might not, be commenting on the updates or anything like that. But the visibility is incredibly helpful from a passive perspective. Just yesterday, I was talking to my chief of staff, and there's an engineering leader whose execution prowess I really admire. And I was saying to her, what I want to know, what their rhythms are, what are their rituals to continue to execute at this level. And there's just so much. I have a call scheduled to kind of interview him on this, and this isn't the first conversation that he and I have had about it. But there's so much I can just learn in the system, based on how his team updating goals, how they're progressing their Jira board. And when you have this open landscape of information where everyone is contributing their progress to this system that I can search through AI, it's just unlimited what I can learn.
Yeah. And that actually ties together a few questions that I hear popping up. I see Ian O'Keefe on the call, and he is wondering about the data. How do you measure impact? And I think some of it you actually answered around the technology that Atlassian, that's kind of native to everyone in Atlassian. So do you
Right.
data, the impact, and how you see the downstream outcomes on the business, sales, marketing, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one question around the data, and it actually ties together a few other questions that popped up in the chat.
I think that there's a lot of questions always about productivity and how to measure outcomes. And the thing that I tend to say about this is we want to make sure that businesses and business teams are achieving their goals. So I do think that the focus on goals helps us get to an outcome orientation, whereas many of the productivity metrics are about time spent. They're kind of, they don't measure the quality of an output. And so you want people to be building sophisticated goals and reaching those goals. I will say at Atlassian, we told a great story in earlier this year where we talked about how being a distributed team and working in this different way helped us release our first AI tool, which is called Rovo. And we did that in 6 months, from announcing it to releasing it to general availability. And that is an enormous pace and something that a faster pace than Atlassian has ever operated at before. And the head of AI gave a long interview to the Washington Post to talk about why it's our distributed norms and our use of this technology that enabled that, because we were able to work around the sun by passing off projects with tons of high context awareness. And we just use technology to support our progress as opposed to needing to get into meetings to do it. We have meetings, we have plenty of meetings, but we're using documentation, communication, and visible technology and AI search and AI support to help us move faster than ever.
There's one question, several questions on the space. Again, I go to Edie and want to add on to her question because you kind of talked about the taxonomy of spaces and how
Yeah.
to find a quiet space, the the more densely attended space, et cetera, et cetera. And my question would be, we hear a lot about smart buildings, smart
Yeah.
spaces, et cetera, et cetera. To what extent do you use technology to identify, how much time people spend in those spaces? And again, to the point, to the question here, sometimes meeting spaces are so hard to book. So
Yeah.
technology is on its way, and does Atlassian use those technologies?
I don't think the technology is totally there yet. And we spend a lot of time talking about the user behavior around these types of things related to book. One of our theses is that people move through a space throughout the day, and we want to encourage them to move through the space. So, we think about, I think hot desking is an overrated concept. And if there is an inventory of desks where the supply is higher than the demand, basically nobody books anything because there's not an advantage to booking. And I think that there is this team use case that hasn't been sorted yet, how to basically groups of people organize together. We kind of have been thinking about, if we could create loyalty programs, kind of where if you check in all the time and you're booking a desk, then you get more privileges to book a larger number of desks or to book a single desk for a larger period of time. And I just don't think the technology is fully there yet. The way that we measure things is we look at our ONA data, so org network analysis data, which looks at collaboration factors, who is meeting with who is communicating with whom, and we pair that to office bookings, office conference room bookings, so that we know a lot about what is actually happening inside those conference rooms. We also do observational studies to validate what we discover thematically in our data and larger ecosystem. But it's not there's some things we know. I think we know that people are gravitating towards library spaces where it's not this open plan setting. It's actually a quiet but open plan setting, where the norm is to be very quiet and focused. And then you need to make that type of space immediately adjacent to enclosed spaces where people can take calls, because otherwise they won't go to the quiet space because they get disrupted by the need to go and find a spot to take a call. So they need to know that that outlet valve is right available to them. We know that there is a tolerance for taking some calls out in the open in these drop-in spaces, but also that drop-in laptop working spaces are insufficient to support kind of general working. I think we over rotated to the idea of collaboration at a certain point, and it's clear that desks with monitors and ergonomic chairs are what powers our knowledge workers. So we need to make sure that we have a sufficient number of them. Um, what's less clear to us is how do, in a world where teams are not co-located, but showing up to the office and being with people you know is at a very high premium. How do you use technology to coordinate that? And I don't think that there is a good solution yet, but with AI, there it should be much, much easier. I do think that people data is a blocker to a lot of this. People data availability, just on a data pipeline basis, on a privacy basis. We haven't really been able to unlock that in the way that personalized consumer technologies are able to utilize data about you to create good experiences for you. And obviously, there are trade offs, right? We want to create a great experience for you, but we also want to make sure that you're treated ethically and that an enterprise doesn't have too much information about who and where you are, right? So those are the trade offs that keep that progress a little bit slow.
You know, what I liked about what you said is, even though we might not have the exact technology that's needed, but we know what we need. And I can
Right.
really see, at least in the startup community, some of those tools are showing up, even though
Hmm.
they're not scaled yet and maybe not adopted by every organization. But in terms of smart spaces, and that's where collaboration with hospitality, collaboration with real estate is going to continue. To your point, I loved what you said about the office. And I'm going to go, there are a few, all the questions are amazing, but there's one question that I think relates to the majority of people here on the call, and that is about um, the skills and experiences that will be helpful to develop for us to be effective distributed workers, both,
Mm,
and selfishly, effective educators, effective leaders, effective managers. Do we need to come up with a new competency model or the new set of
mm.
requirements for who is an effective manager in those types of settings?
That's really interesting. And, I wouldn't I guess my thesis is that everyone's distributed. Every company that's operating beyond the scale of one room is distributed. And so I think this is a conversation mostly about the era of work that we're in, the era of AI enabled work, than it is particularly about distributed work. But I think that it is a real problem set. And I'm sure that there are people who are smarter on this than me. But as somebody who studies how we work and as a leader in these organizations, I think that there's a premium on being creative, having deep empathy and authenticity, um, being really, really curious, because you can find out anything, but you have to be motivated enough to go find it out. Nobody's going to tell you anymore. Um, and finding answers in the context of ambiguity, there's so much ambiguity. Even you can't rely on an org chart anymore. There is no stable org chart. We have to think about who has influence in what setting, and who holds the decision and what key area, and which area is more important than what the trade-offs will be. Certainly that's always been true in business, but before, you used to be able to look at an org chart and rely on it, and that's just no longer the case. Um, and what else would I say? Communication. If you should be hacking your way to being the most effective communicator that you possibly can, to have a lot of empathy for people, because we're trading messages back and forth all the time. Make those messages short, smart, and clear.
Excellent, excellent. There were a few questions about groups, etc. Please go to Atlassian website, and the big report on that Annie put together on distributed workplaces. That's where you are going to find a lot of these points, very visually presented. The data are amazing. So that's the recommendation I would go. And a lot of other research points that you can pick up from Atlassian's website, because I think they're seeing themselves, and rightly so, as the leader in this distributed, next generation distributed workplaces, and the research is very solid. Yes, there are PhD psychologists working on the team. There are all kinds of expertise that contributed to this research. Thank you so much. Just a couple of final points about our upcoming events. We are going to have, again, Working for a Future, March 5th, March 19th, the inclusion equation. And we are going to have a few events and conferences. So please follow us for updates. And thank you, everyone, very much. Send your individual emails or connect on LinkedIn. Annie has a huge following there. And as I said, please spend some time. And it's a lot of fun time, by the way, on Atlassian's website. Thank you so much, Annie. That was a lot of
Thank
fun.
you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.